Hey everyone, welcome back to The Current. This is Real Talk on Real Topics. We've got Prudence back with us today. Really excited about that. And Curtis and myself. And a great topic today, the death penalty. One I've been looking forward to. I'm really excited about this conversation today.
Yeah.
I think the death penalty is exciting. Exciting thing to talk about.
Not exciting, like, yeah.
Yeah, I guess I should phrase that. Exciting thing to talk about.
Yeah.
We're all very passionate about it.
Very passionate about it. If you know me or know our church, this is something that comes up a lot and something that we are deeply passionate about and feel a very strong conviction of. And so I want to just talk about, just in general, our church's response to the death penalty and why, and then we can kind of get more into the specifics. So if you're new to Rhythm or maybe you're new to the podcast, we pride ourselves on being what we call like a Jesus-centered church, a Christ-centered church, and that's more than just language. We really try to take a Jesus-centered approach to most things. And so Jesus, in our opinion, should inform all of our thoughts, our actions, our decisions, how we view the world. And so we believe here at Rhythm that Jesus informs our ethic or our view of the death penalty as well. And we would say that I think we are anti-death penalty as a whole. As a staff, I think we're all on the same page. Although there might be other areas that we maybe disagree with, I think we're all in agreement that the death penalty is not the way of Jesus. And we can talk about why. Yeah. I think there's many reasons to why. So I know you, Prudence, something you're deeply passionate about. You want to be on this episode today, which I'm glad you are. What are some of just maybe some of the first kind of high points you would say as to...
Oh, gosh.
Yeah.
Okay, so I just want to preface this by saying I'm going to come off sounding a little bullish. When we are doing this podcast, usually I think we're very open-handed, open-minded, but I will say, this is one thing. There are not many things that I will say confidently, like, you are wrong if you believe this. This is one that I will go to my deathbed saying, like, the death penalty is wrong, and if you believe it's okay, you are wrong. So if that offends anyone, like, I'm sorry, but I am trying to save lives here. So
No, yeah, and I think that's a good point. And just to clarify, like, we can have this conviction. You can agree to disagree, but we do think you're wrong.
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
mean, like, and we can do it respectfully, and we will be respectful. But yeah, I would agree. I think this is one that's there's lives at stake.
Yeah, this is an issue that's passionate for us, so don't mind if we get a little bit passionate here.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Okay, now that I've said that, I'm going to have to be really, really careful because there are so many ways we can take this. Obviously, race plays into that. We can have that conversation. We can talk about prison reform. We can talk about the American justice system. But at our core, like, when we're talking about the death penalty and why we're so passionate about it, we're talking about preserving life. We're talking about grace. We're talking about forgiveness. And there's this incredible Martin Luther King quote that I'm totally going to botch, but basically it says something like this. The existence of the death penalty is our society's way of saying you are beyond forgiveness.
That's right.
And that's
exactly right.
That breaks me.
Yep.
And that kind of, for me,
spot on, though.
Yeah, that leads and informs how I approach this topic because we are a Jesus-centered church, and so we believe in forgiveness, we believe in grace, and ultimately, I would hope that we would have a restorative approach to justice, which we can talk about more later. But that's kind of how I approach this.
Yeah, and I want to just piggyback on that and say, like, I think, growing up in the South, I feel like there's more of a, just kind of expectation that the death penalty is normal. It's right. I mean, I grew up thinking like, oh, it's totally normal. Like, everyone just gets the chair or like whatever. It's like, it's just like, it's how it should be. But it wasn't until I was an adult that someone really challenged me with that very same question. Like, is there anyone that is outside the redeeming hand of God? Anyone? Well, obviously the answer is no. And if you truly believe in forgiveness, in, restoration, then we can't just give up on people. We can't just be like, play God in a sense and say, sorry, there's no hope for you. Like, you're just, I totally agree.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to add to just kind of the intro topic here?
Yeah, I just think, I want it to be said that the perspective I'm coming from, and I think we're coming from, is unashamedly Jesus-informed, Christocentric, and Christian grounded. So, I understand there's some arguments more broadly, but for me, it does come down to if I'm taking the Christian story seriously, then yeah, we are all people who were, as Paul says, sinners under just sentence of death. But the good news is that sentence was not executed upon us, that there's grace even for someone who's in this position. And so it just seems a difficult thing to take this Christian story about grace and mercy, and then somehow at the end of that end up saying, oh, it's okay, let's kill some people if they're doing bad stuff.
For sure. And I think it's also really important that people understand as we continue to dive into this topic today that none of us are like anti-justice. It's not saying that there shouldn't be consequences for people's actions, and I think that's clear. I don't think any of us would say like we're anti people having consequences for choices they've made.
Right.
Whatever those may be. Now, obviously, death is not on the list of acceptable ones. You know what I'm saying? And there's other ones, too, I would say, like, I'm not for. But I think all of us would agree, like, there's consequences for actions. Like, if there's something that happens, like, there's also consequences. But it's not to say that we're not fighting for justice. And I think a lot of times people equate, like, anti-death penalty or anti-even violence in general, then you're just okay with anything. Like, you don't actively fight justice, or then... like, how do you care about others? Like, it's not, there's other ways to go about it than, like, penalty. You know what I'm saying? Like, there's, like, a view of, like, restoration. And so I'd say, like, all of us, we're passionate about justice. It just might look differently than what you're accustomed to hearing or thinking. I don't think any of us are just like, oh, like, anybody, you can just kill somebody. No big deal. Like, it's like, it's not,
right.
We don't have that approach.
Well, and that's a big movement right now. Like, kind of what we thought about as justice in that sense has been very punitive, right? We punish people. There's a consequence that they get. But there's a big movement for restorative justice, which is this justice that says, you have done this thing. Now let's partner with people in your community. Let's have conversations with the victims, not just to punish you, not just to give you a slap on the wrist, but give you an opportunity to make things right, to make a situation whole. And that's a really complex, nuanced thing we don't need to get into. But I do think it's important for us as we're having this conversation to just challenge ourselves and ask ourselves, when we are convicting people, when we're sending them to prison, what's our end goal here? Do we want to just punish them, or do we want to rehabilitate them? Do we want to actually fix the brokenness in people's lives that's been caused by these criminal offenses?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Is the American jail system or jail systems in general, is it something that's merely punitive, or is this a correctional facility? Is our goal to say, hey, we're taking people who aren't healthy and good for society, or a hindrance to it, or a harm to it, take them in, rehabilitate them, put them out as functioning members of society again? And that's a very different look from just like, nah, the guy's just there to get his just desserts. And so I think we need to have maybe a more holistic understanding of what are we really doing when we're talking about the criminal justice system or the jailing system.
Yeah, and I think that would be a great episode. Maybe we could dive more into the justice system. And before, again, like, we're going to get into some of the specific arguments against the death penalty. But again, I just want to say, like, if you're pro death penalty, you are not alone in that. I mean, even today I was telling these guys that I get on Facebook. This is being recorded right on the tail end of the Chauvin trial, and he was just convicted on 3 counts after taking George Floyd's life, essentially. And like, our local newspaper put a question on Facebook. Just said, "Do you think the jury got it right in the Chauvin case?" And a Christian whom I know said, "Yes, hang the expletive," like, I mean, literally their approach was like, this guy should die, like, and so it's very common, but that doesn't mean that it's right. It doesn't mean that but you're not alone. That's all I was gonna say. It's like, you're not alone in that thinking. And again, I used to think the same thing until Jesus began to really inform my ethic and my view of people.
And I think that's a good chance to bring up and say that there's nothing, it's not like I can't get behind or even sympathize to a degree. I understand you see something as terrible as what we saw happen to George Floyd, and there is sometimes something within you that says, oh, something needs to happen here. Like, that's not okay. You want something like that. But I think the Christian message does call us to say, oh my goodness, we've been forgiven so much. We've been forgiven so much. How can we look and say, hey, how can we extend grace in this? I mean, the Christian story has been one that's been marked by radical forgiveness. And I mean, looking even at Jesus' ministry, he makes no limit on what comes for forgiveness. He tells them not to, do an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Jesus, like you said, forgives the adulterous woman who the law condemns to death as a just sentence. And so, not that I can't sympathize, but I think I meet Jesus and he has to check that feeling in my heart a bit.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it's really, tempting for us, when we see some sort of horrible evil, like the George Floyd case or other things, we see these people who are murderers and have done the most abominable, unimaginable acts. And we want to come for them with our pitchforks. But what we forget is, when we are killing people who kill other people, we're creating more trauma, right? Yes, they had their victims. Those families have trauma, but then we're creating trauma in the lives of the people whose job it is to murder them. Right. We're putting trauma in the lives of their families now, who not only have they watched their loved one, go through the trial system, they found out they committed this unspeakable act, but then they have to go forward with the knowledge that this person is now dead. So we're just creating more pain, more suffering. We're not actually looking at ways to redeem this situation. In fact, we're declaring ourselves and our government God and saying, let's take their life. And we really need to rethink that approach.
Yeah, I agree. Well, I want to get into some of the more specific arguments, and I just want to start, and then I know we can talk about things like even statistics and saying how this is wrong. And there's other things we can get into, but I want to start the argument by saying Jesus, one of his, I think, just like key kind of stances that he really emphasized was enemy love. And so kind of what you were saying, Curtis, like something that he is just kind of marked by, and something that doesn't make sense to our world is this idea of enemy love. And I love what we see in the New Testament. Jesus even like throws him a bone and says like, hey, you've heard it said an eye for an eye or tooth for a tooth, but I tell you, hey, like it's always been this way. Somebody does something to you, you do something back. It's always been this way, but I tell you. Then Jesus comes along and says, but I say, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. And so like I would consider, I don't know about you or people that are listening, but I would consider like a murderer, somebody that we would deem, deserves the death penalty as an enemy, like an enemy of people, an enemy of love, an enemy of like whatever you want to say. But Jesus commands me to love even those that are really, really difficult to love. And how could I, as a Christian, love somebody and simultaneously want them dead? It's just not possible, And I just think like that is like, to me, one of the strongest arguments as like if we are going to live like Christ, and if we're going to obey his commands, if we're going to try our hardest to be like him, and he commands us to love even those that are really, really hard to love, how can I love somebody and want them to die? It's just not possible. It just doesn't compute. And so I know that's just one argument, but I know there's more. You guys have other things you want to bring up, but I just wanted to kick it off and say, hey, like enemy love, I think is one of the strongest arguments to, anti-death penalty.
For sure. And I even in that passage is sort of a pushback against this sort of tit for tat mentality, this idea of like, you took a life, your life gets taken, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. So this sort of, equal weight just doesn't work in Jesus's economy, which is interesting. And I keep thinking back. I just have all these different statements of Jesus coming to mind where he says, Peter comes up and says, how many times should I forgive someone that's wronged me? 7? And she's like 70 times 7. As many times as someone repents, you must forgive them. Right. It's just great. Enemy love is a great way to put it. Jesus is just saturated by this. And so, I find it hard to square with the taking of someone's life.
Let's turn the conversation a little bit and talk more about, I know you've done some research on the death penalty. I'd love to hear just kind of your just general take on like how we've gotten this wrong, not even just like in a crisis-centric way, but like how do we got this wrong, just some of the effects of just doing it wrong. Or just like just not
Well, let's
yeah.
And I think we can let people's facts and stories speak for themselves. Like, let's just pause for a moment. Let's take Jesus out of the equation.
Yep.
There could be someone listening to this who isn't sold out on Jesus, and that's fine. And I think that there are other approaches to the death penalty. one, if you consider yourself like politically, fiscally conservative, it actually costs more money to put someone to death than it does to just keep them in prison alive for the rest of their lives.
Wow.
So that's huge right there if that's kind of your approach.
Yeah, because I usually hear the other thing. It's like, oh, it's so expensive keeping all these inmates, you know, let's just go ahead and, which again, it sounds very cold and callous as well. But so to hear that that's not the case, it's interesting to me.
Yeah, and that's to say nothing of, you know, actual execution methods and the ways it can be botched and there's a lot of research now saying like these merciful, painless ways that we try to put people down, which sounds horrible, are actually like not so painless. And again, people on the other side could say, they're murderers, they're rapists, you know, they deserve to feel pain. Sure. But if we're trying to be humane with this, we also kind of need to rethink that approach. So an interesting thought that I think will be kind of jarring for people is if you look at the entire world, if you look at all the countries in the world, the top executing countries, and we don't have data on some of them like North Korea. I think there was another one, maybe Vietnam was one we don't have data on, but the top executing countries in the world are China, Iran, Egypt, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and then it's us. We are number 6 on the list of countries that have the most executions, which is really interesting. Another really big one that I think we can pause and talk about is that for every 9 executions, every 9 people on death row who actually die, there's one exoneration. 1 out of every 10 people who's on death row is proven innocent. And that's just the ones we know about. Yep. I don't know about you guys, but like if I go to the doctor for a surgery and they say, well, like 1 out of 10 times we really mess you up, like I'm not going to that doctor, you know. Think about that statistic in terms of like cars you might drive or flights you would get on. If 1 out of every 10 planes is falling out of the sky, I'm never flying again. And so there's that question of innocence that, I don't know, I think we can talk about for a little bit.
Absolutely. I think we have to ask ourselves the question: if we are pro death penalty, and we have to acknowledge that it's not perfect in our execution of it. What is the margin of error we can consider to be comfortable? You know, and that's 10%. That's a crazy thing. 1 out of every 10 people. It's like, okay, are we fine then if it's all right, 5 out of every 100 that we're putting to death that are actually innocent, and it's tough for me to be able to justify it in saying, if we're putting to death 1 innocent person or 2, I don't know. It's a hard pill to swallow.
You can no longer say they're getting what they deserve because they're innocent.
How many guilty people's lives is worth 1 innocent person's life? How do we weigh these scales? And that's a very difficult, thorny question.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a book and then a movie that came out a couple years ago, Just Mercy, by Bryan Stevenson, that a lot of people have watched and is getting people talking. And if you're a reader or if you're a movie lover, I would encourage you to watch that. Watch Bryan Stevenson's story. He's this lawyer who has committed his life now to just getting people off death row and demanding justice and truth. And it's just a really profound real life story of this man who was wrongly accused, and race was a huge part of that case. He was on death row, and then Bryan Stevenson got him out, and then they just go around and tell that story. But we also need to talk about prejudices and the amount of people who are minorities that are on death row versus the amount of white people who are actually causing these crimes. And if you look at the court cases and statistics, there's a higher statistic of people going to death row when the victim, a murder victim, was white and the murderer was black. So there are white murderers running around who killed white people, who killed black people, but for some reason juries are not putting them on death row. So how do we make this a level playing field? Why do some people get the chair or whatever else and other people don't? So that's a huge conversation.
Yeah, and so much of this goes hand in hand with just like, again, like our justice system, how we handle things, like what is the motive? Like we were talking about before, is it punitive? Is it restorative? A lot of that is hand in hand, and also goes hand in hand with like this idea of violence, like just in general. Like you might say that it's humane way to put someone down, but really, I mean, you're inflicting pain on somebody, and there's just so many different facets of ways we can take the conversation, and race included, like if studies are showing that it's like, why? Like at the heart of like, there's so much brokenness just at the issue of this idea of death penalty. So many areas of just brokenness and ways in which it's just disgusting.
Yeah.
It really is. You know, it is. It's disgusting in so many ways. I think. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to take a bit of a turn, and even just to say, you know, to bring it back and just thinking about just some of the key figures, even in like a Christian faith, or bring it back to a Christian perspective, is to say like, oh my gosh, we've got, you know, Paul, who was a murderer and went around and killed a bunch of Christians, and to think like, well, that guy, you know, a killer, and that dude needs to be put to death. We miss out on a great redemptive work of God and saying, hey, how can we undo this? We look at Moses, who had killed someone. I think another just really important thing to consider is that we worship a God who was unjustly executed by the state. And that's an interesting component.
I was hoping somebody would bring that up. I was like, I mean, seriously, like if you're a Christian, you have to understand that the person you follow was exactly unjustly killed by the state. Like he did nothing wrong. Yeah. He was perfect.
Yeah.
And he was put to death.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, ugh. Like, I don't know if there's a more powerful argument simply than that, but whatever.
Yeah. You know, again, I just can't, and I understand, like I said, that just kind of a pull sometimes to see like, oh, this is something heinous, something has to be done. And that sort of feel for wanting to be put to rights, I think is a good one. It's just misdirected at times when we take it the way of the death penalty. You know, I think the book of James puts it great. Mercy triumphs over judgment. You know, grace is what changed lives. And we need to be able to, extend that even to our enemies, you know, even the most heinous.
Exactly. And there's an element too, I think, you know, even when we're longing for that justice and we want to put these wrongs to right, when we're crying for the death penalty, there's this element of dehumanization. You know, we forget, we make it all about what they did and
not who they are.
Yeah, not who they are. And even, you know, to some degree focusing too much on the victims, although I don't know, maybe I didn't put that quite right, but you know what I mean? We're not thinking about this person.
It's still a brother, a sister, a mom, a dad. Like it's still like somebody that other people deeply care about, and their life is important also.
Exactly. To say nothing of mental illnesses that could be present, past traumas that could be endured. And again, not that, you know, someone's abuse makes it okay for them to be a murderer, but like, let's talk about like this person didn't necessarily wake up and just decide like, I'm going to do something evil. What was happening in their life, in society, that led up to this, and how can we restore that rather than just killing someone, because that is what the death penalty is. It is state mandated murder.
You know, I think it's so true. We need to take into account sort of the background of the person and what goes on, because I found it to be so true that hurt people. You know, a lot of times people who are, you know, perpetrators of abuse are people who had been abused themselves in the past. It's sort of this vicious cycle, you know, and just to, again, when you begin to take a step back and see this person, not as just a perpetrator, but a human with the context and a story, it can look a little bit different. And this is a conversation I have sometimes, even when it comes to just the use of violence or lethal force in general. People will, you know, play the what if game, like, what if someone broke into your house and was gonna, you know, kill your wife or whatever. What I turn back to them and I often say is, okay, what if it was your son that was, you know, had a rampage, had some problem, has a drug issue, breaking in, could you pull the trigger then? What if it's your son who committed the murder and is sitting there? Would you say, yep, it's just, this is what you got to have done? There'd be something that tugs there that says, oh no, show mercy, show mercy. And so I think Jesus' call is to say, how can we look at these people as our brother, our sister? How can we see them as, our own kin? It becomes a whole lot harder to just go through and say, execute them when it's your loved one, when it's your child, when it's your brother, when it's your sister.
It's always different when it's personal. But that is the type of love Jesus calls us to, is that personal, brotherly affection, you know, like someone that you deeply, deeply care of. And that's so good. And I want to just wrap up the conversation, because this has been so good. I know we've kind of thrown a lot at you, a lot of different angles, you know, but I do want to wrap up the conversation just by sharing a little bit about some resources. I know I wanted to mention, I think a great resource on this particular topic, the death penalty, or just maybe even just nonviolence in general, is Shane Claiborne. He has like a really just passionate movement where they actually, you know, if there's something you want to get behind, I know they actually like will gather and protest death penalties, or they'll call the, you know, particular person in charge of that state. And like try to get it overturned, and on behalf of these people, they're actively fighting. And so if that's something you might be interested in or deeply passionate about, he's a great resource. You can look him up online.
He wrote a fantastic book called Executing Grace. And so it's a book all about the death penalty too. Some really good perspective there. For sure. Check him out.
Any other resources or anything else you wanted to say just as we close?
One thing I would just say is, like, I think that we have a bit of a sense of urgency with this topic, and one of the big reasons behind that is this is something that's happening a lot more now. There's a difference between federal and state executions, and more states are actually saying, like, no, we're not doing the death penalty anymore, which is incredible. But if we're talking about federal executions, so federal crimes, literally the U.S. government, it's not by state. So since 1927, there have been 50 federal executions, right? So there were a bunch a long time ago. And then from 1964 to 2000, there were none. Zero federal executions. And then there were just 3 in the 2000s. And then since July of 2020, we have had 14 federal executions. Starting in July, Trump and I believe it was William Barr at the time basically said, like, let's get this going. Let's start these up again. And so I think it's really important for us to be aware of what's happening, and the fact that this is happening in crazy numbers. Of all of the federal executions that have happened in the last 20 years, more than half of them have happened within the last year.
Yeah, that's crazy. I think that is a good point to bring up and just sort of raise awareness, because that's not something the public consciousness. I don't know about these kind of things. Even just sitting here, I'm surprised to hear that. So, just to be informed, to look into that stuff is really good. You might be surprised what you find.
Yeah, and you can do something about it. If you are a Christian who is passionate about it, you can look to people like Shane Claiborne and other resources, and they will have action steps where you can call your governor, or your senator, or whoever. Right. You can attend protests, and these things actually do matter, and we can cause change, because there is this shift in perspective right now where more and more people in our country are against this, and it's something that I think, hopefully in my lifetime, like, we can just see it abolished federally and statewide. So
that'd be great. Yeah. And I know Shane Claiborne has shared success stories of their kind of their movement having a little bit of a grip, and there's been like celebrations where, like, hey, this has been halted because of our efforts. Like, he is actually alive still, or she, or whoever it is actually alive still because of our efforts. And I encourage you to really jump on that. And you're right, there's a sense of urgency. It's happening at an alarming rate. And again, if we are Christians being informed by Christ, and we view people as we should be viewing people, and we believe in a God of restoration, we believe in a God of redemption, a God that doesn't give up on people, we shouldn't either. So it's been a great conversation. I love it. Thanks, guys, for your work, your research, time, and your wisdom in this area. I know I appreciate it, and hopefully you've enjoyed the conversation. And you can look forward to topics like this each and every Friday. So thanks for joining with us. Have a great weekend. Grace and peace.